No, nobody wants to give me a job, it must be my colour. Why were all these white men interviewing me? Weren't there any women? If you knew you had a house that was on a rough part of the estate, who were you going to choose? Who would last the longest in that property? You walk into a bedroom with water literally dripping off the bedroom ceiling onto the beds, and the only advice you could give a tenant was open your windows and turn the heating on. So I grew up in Bradford, Yorkshire, and I am second generation Caribbean. My parents came from Dominica in the West Indies. I would say that my family, there were three things that were important: faith, education, and you had to do your best. You had to do your best, so you had to have values. So growing up, we were quite a small family unit. My mum, dad, my sister and me, but we come from a larger extended family. My mother was one of 13, she was the last, the youngest, and the only one of her brothers and sisters that moved to the UK. And my dad was one of 8. So we had numerous uncles and aunties, cousins, second cousins, third cousins living around. We grew up in Bradford, as I said, and we grew up on a council estate, Schoolmore Estate, Lidget Green. And we were one of the first black families that moved onto this estate. I think all in all there were about 5, including our family, there were 5 black families on this estate, no Asian families. And there was a strategy to try and introduce ethnic minorities onto all white estates. So it was kind of difficult, but when you grew up in the 70s, it was expected to be difficult. We didn't know anything else, and you were given strategies for dealing with it. And the question was, how would you get around it? So, you had the name calling, you had eggs being thrown at your door, problems in school, but you always knew how to deal with it, or you could talk to your parents who guided you on how to deal with it. And one of the things that we were taught was to stand up for ourselves and to be respectful of authority, but always stand up for ourselves. After finishing my degree, I was looking for work, and back in the 80s, the mid-80s, the north of England kind of was economically a bit of a mess. That was the time of the miners' strikes. There was a lot of unemployment. My father was unemployed for quite some time. So after I finished my degree, I was looking for work. There was very little to be had. But my sister, who had just had a baby, got a temporary job in the job centre. So in order that I could go and speak to her every day, I would go in and fill in application forms while I was sat speaking to her. And one of these application forms happened to be for a clerical officer in the education personnel department, and it was part-time. And because I got this job, I was getting as much as I would do on the dole. And by the time you've paid your bus fares and your lunch money, of course you're worse off than being on the dole. So I needed to find a second job. So I tramped around Bradford looking for a job, and I found being honest wasn't going to get me a job because for whatever reason, nobody wanted to give me a job, especially if I said I had a degree. So I went into Pizza Hut and I lied, and they said, I told them I had A-levels. That's how I got the job. And he said, oh, why do you want to work here with A-levels? And I just said, no, nobody wants to give me a job. It must be my colour. I don't know what. And he said, no, it's not your colour. It's not your colour. You can have a job. It's just that I wondered why you want to work here. Anyway, so I worked in Pizza Hut for 2 years, as well as working in education personnel. While I was working at Pizza Hut, I used to see all of these different characters coming in, and you'd have regulars. And one of my regulars happened to be a housing officer. And at the time, I didn't know what a housing officer wanted, but he was quite a silly bloke. I thought he was silly. And he told me what he did. And I was actually quite jealous of him, because in those days, I know this sounds stupid, but he wore, one of I guess you'd call them a donkey jacket. So they're quite they were blue jackets, and if you worked outdoors, you had a jacket. But I could tell it must have been an important job. That's what I thought. So when he told me what he did, and I thought, my God, I could do that job, and I'm working at Pizza Hut. So we did this, carried on. I never thought anything more about it until I saw the job advertised. And when the job was advertised, there must have been 6 pages of this job description. And had I not spoken to this regular client, I would never have applied for this job. But because I knew, someone who I thought was a bit of an idiot could do that job, I thought, well, if he can do it, I can. And these were the days before we had computers, So I just went down to the regular library, did a little bit of homework on what a housing officer was, applied for the job. The ignorance of youth, I was quite bolshy. I asked them why, because, I had all of this equalities experience now. So I asked them, why were all these white men interviewing me? Weren't there any women? And why, weren't there any ethnic minorities working in housing? And they, and they were saying, well, we're trying to do something about it. And I got the job as a housing officer. So my very first job in housing in March 1986 was working for Bradford Council on the Idle Housing Office, Swain House Estate, Idle Village and Esholt. And if you know Esholt is where Emmerdale Farm was filmed, but it's where Emmerdale Farm is based. So that's kind of how I got into housing. So the sector back then, at the time I was working on council estates where the housing was pretty dire. I was embarrassed sometimes because my job used to be to allocate housing as well as maintain housing. And many a time I was embarrassed at the type of housing that I would have to allocate. We did our best. It wasn't that we weren't doing our best, but you would have a list of homeless people that would come along every week. You were given the list, and you had a list of houses that were available, and you knew which parts of the estate were better than others. And all of these people needed housing, but you had to figure out which one made the best match. And very often it was, if you knew you had a house that was on a rough part of the estate, who were you going to choose? Who would last the longest in that property, given the surroundings? We had lots of houses with condensation, and it was just awful, you know, one heater in the sitting room. You walk into a bedroom with water literally dripping off the bedroom ceiling onto the beds, and the only advice you could give a tenant was open your windows and turn the heating on. And that was another reason I just wanted to get out of housing management, not because I felt that we did a bad job in terms of how we did our work, because there's no doubt people worked as hard as they could do, but the resources that we had were dire. And when I moved into developing housing, it was because I wanted to be proud of the work that I was doing. So moving on, I would say that things have changed. There's been a lot of money spent on housing. I think things have changed substantially, you know, in terms of the lack of housing, the lack of the right sort of housing. And I would just point to the fact that, you know, although I moved to London, I still managed to buy my house in the 90s. My nephews and nieces will not be able to do that. Or they will be probably nearing retirement. You know, the only way they will be able to buy property is if they move out of London. It just makes me wonder why housing is not taken seriously, when housing impacts on so many parts of our lives. It affects health, physical health, mental health, stability. It affects education. And so many problems could be solved if we invested in housing. So in some ways, things have got better. You know, there's been a lot of improvements to the housing that I grew up with, but then the lack of housing and the future for many people, and the maintenance, because we've, you know, a lot of the organisations that are responsible for housing have had to, well, they're mortgaged up to the hilt, aren't they? And they don't have the money to spend on maintenance, you know, and there's, you know, so we've still got so many issues that need to be addressed. So the idea to set up women in social housing, it wasn't my idea. So first and foremost, I have to give credit to my colleague Nicola Dib, because I met Nicola just through working in London, really. And back in those days, in the 90s, I think women tended to gravitate to each other because they were a rare species. So if you met at a conference or through work, you would then arrange to go out for a drink, or arrange to see each other. So we knew each other on the circuit, and then in the 90s, I think it was, no, the early 2000s, we worked together. I joined her a construction company called Waits, and we worked together. And early on in that working relationship, Nicola explained to me her concept. She even had a title for it, Women in Social Housing, WISH. And she said she'd had this idea. She'd had a couple of events, but she wasn't quite sure how to take it forward. Was it something that we could work together? So yeah, we agreed we'd sit down and we would figure out a strategy for how we could make it work. And because we were working at this construction company, we could use it as a tool for connecting with clients. So we even got funding through our, through our boss to kind of run all of these events. They were quite popular. We probably ran, I'd guess maybe 3 or 4 over a year or so. And I remember there were a number of pivotal moments along our journey in terms of the development of Wish. So one of them was the CIH, Chartered Institute of Housing South East event in Brighton. And we had, I think it was us or somebody else held it. It was a women who lunch. And there were quite a few people from the London region came down to that, and we were women, and we all sat down and we were talking about Wish. And there were so many women there who just said they absolutely loved the concept, that they really wanted us to do this, but in order for it to happen, for it to be sustainable, we possibly needed to tweak it. So we needed to have speakers. We needed to have the involvement of not just Waits, but other contractors and other private sector organisations. And we needed volunteers because it was becoming too worldly for myself and Nicola. So again, we sat down. We used to meet up at weekends and just work the entire weekend and figure out the changes that we would need and pull people in. So we kind of got a little core group of people who could help us. I don't want to mention different organisations because I'll forget organisations, but there were surveying organisations, there were housing associations, architectural firms, building contractors, developers, consultants. All of these women were really interested for different reasons. Some because they found it a natural place where you could get support from other women. And it also meant that if you met these women, if you then went to a conference, you saw them in the room, then you already knew somebody. For others, it was about learning, it was about jobs, it was about profile. So there were different reasons for coming together, but we all could. Myself and Nicola sat down and we thought, well, how if we are going to go out to regions outside of London, how are we going to do that? Because we've still got our day jobs. We don't have time to go running up to Manchester, Wales, Scotland, or wherever it is. How are we going to do that? So we looked at a model, so McDonald's. How they, like McDonald's, I can't remember what you call it. Franchise model. So we kind of sort of bastardized that, and we just said, right, so this is the model. If you want to set up Wish in your region, this is what Wish is. This is what you have to do. These are the steps you have to take. We suggest that you have taster sessions, that you must make it 50%, or try and make it 50% public sector, 50% private sector, because one feeds the other. That you have to have a chair, that you have to have treasurer, someone to do education, so there are all of these different things that you must have. And then if you can still do all of that, you can be a member of Wish. And we started getting applications in from people who said they were interested, and we worked with them. And that's how it grew, kind of organically. Am I proud? Yes, very, very proud of what we've achieved. But I'm proud not just for myself and Nicola. I think I'm proud for the women who've been involved, because so many people have got things out of Wish. People have got new jobs. People have got confidence. People, you know, just yesterday I heard a young woman talking about her mental health, and she talked about the fact that she realised she wasn't on her own, and that she was able to open up because she knows she's not on her own. And you know, that's what I said kind of when I was leaving as chair, that one of the reasons I came into Wish was because I always felt that I was always on my own, the only black person in many organisations, the only black, in many meetings, the only woman. And so it was great to be in this environment, not just an environment, it was a lively, active, vibrant environment where people could, I don't want to say love, but it is, there's a feeling of love there, because many of these women I'm still friends with today. I speak to them outside of work. I've been on holiday with them. They give, if I need any advice whatsoever, I know that there is somebody in there that will support me. There's people who support me without me even knowing it. I remember I got made redundant, and one woman rang me, and I'd not spoken to her for a while, and she just rang me to see how I was, and I was just telling her, yeah, you know, it's been difficult, and one of my clients didn't pay me, and so that was a little bit of a struggle. And just out of the blue she said, oh, you know, if you need money you can always ask me. And I thought, well, no, I didn't, but now I do know. And that's just a wonderful thing. And that is an example of just not being on your own, and just, you know, just people there who are ready to support you if you do need the support. I can't allow myself to think of it in those terms. I think going back to the beginning of our conversation when we talked about growing up, racism was a part of life, and as you grew up, the challenge was how to deal with racism. So as an example, growing up, it was drummed into us, you had to be not just equal to your white friends, you had to be better. Because if you were going for a job and the both of you went for a job and you were both equal, you wouldn't get the job. So you had to make sure that you were better. And so that, if you like, that was your mindset. It doesn't mean, you know, it doesn't mean that you hate your white friends or you hate Asian friends or anything, but you had to work at being the best you could be. And if you like, that has followed me throughout my life. You know, it's something that's drummed into the back of you, into the back of your mind. So then, as you talk about being black, I don't know whether or not being black or a woman has had a negative effect. What I can tell you is my focus is always on the positives. So I do know that I'm not always liked. Now, whether or not that's because I'm black or woman or I'm from Yorkshire, I couldn't tell you which one of those. You know, sometimes you can guess, but, you know, I don't make it my issue. But I can tell you that I stand out because being black, being from Yorkshire, certain accent, so even on the phone, I stand out. Even if people don't know what colour I am, they can tell that I'm different. Working in a construction company, being the only woman, black, in a department, I stand out. So if I do a good job, I stand out. And that's the way I kind of deal with it. There are times when there have been challenges. You know, that's not to say that I haven't had challenges, but I have always used my network to get through my challenges. In answer to your question, I'm sure there have been times when there's been racism and sexism, but I try not to take that on my shoulder because that's not really my problem. I look at the problem in front of me and figure out how I can get around it. I use those people around me because I have, I have a huge network of women, but I have lots of men who support me as well. And so even in those difficult times, I've always been able to find a way through. So I was working in the Northwest and we were in a meeting, and there was a building contractor in the room and various consultants, and we were talking about a problem on site, and the building contractor was talking about a problem that he needed to resolve, but he likened it to a nigger in the woodpile. And my head kind of shot up, I don't know why I didn't get whiplash. And I looked at him, and then I looked, there must have been 10 people in this room, and I looked around the room, and my boss happened to be at this meeting, and she just carried on talking as normal. And I looked at the employer's agent, and they just carried on talking as normal. And I realised nobody had heard it. They weren't bad people. In fact, my friend, she's still one of my best friends to this day, but she hadn't heard it. And I was looking round this sea of white faces, and inside I was seething. And I thought, right, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I thought, right, when it comes to taking him, showing him out, normally my boss would say, oh, would you mind showing him out? I was like, right, when I get hold of him, I'm going to tell him. And on this particular day, she said, right, I'll take him out. I'll take him out, Deborah, you go, because we were going out for lunch. You go get ready, we'll go out for lunch. And I thought, does she know what I'm going to do? So she didn't. We went out for lunch. There was three of us, myself, my boss, and the employer's agent. And I just kept looking at them, and I kept thinking, they really don't know what's happened. So when I got home, I told a friend of mine, a black friend, and she said, you what? I would have done this, and I would have done that, and I would have done this. And she said, and you didn't say anything. I said, I wanted to, but there were so many people around, and my boss was there, and I was waiting for her to say something, and she didn't. And so I thought, right, and I didn't want to embarrass anybody. That was it. I just didn't want to embarrass. I wanted to deal with the situation, but I didn't want to embarrass anybody. So I rang my boss over the weekend, and I told her, and immediately I told her. She was apologetic. She said she didn't hear it, but she believed me. And I told her what I was going to do in no uncertain terms. And she said, before you do anything, let me speak to, it was like our managing director. And she said, we'll speak to you on Monday. And I had this list of things I was going to go in, right? I'm going to speak to the contractor. I'm going to tell him that you dare do anything like that again. And if you do, this is what I'm going to do. So I had all of this, in my head. And as soon as I walked in the door of the office, the managing director, Alan Ramsey, big shout out if he listens to this podcast. He called me into his office and he said, Deborah, I want to see you. And I said, oh no, I've just got to, no, I want to see you now. So he called me in and he said, Judith told me what happened. First of all, I'm really sorry. That should never have happened. And they, expect a phone call from him because he will be apologising. And so, it kind of took everything away from me that I was going to say. And so all I could say was, I am going to speak to him, and I am going to tell him how I feel. And he said, yeah, you do that. And I said, oh, okay then, okay. So, but what that taught me was to stand up for myself. I think prior to that, I was always deferential, and I think I still am a little bit, and that was how I was brought up, you know, to give deference to your boss and to have respect. And I realised that I had to stand up, I had to be the voice, I had to say, but do it in a way that you want people to realise why you're doing it. For me, it's about making sure that you're surrounded by strong people, whether or not that's male or female. We're all going to have challenges in life, you know, and mine may be black, female, woman, Yorkshire. Yours might be bald, white.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You know, but we're all going to have challenges. For some people, it's going to be health. And the question is, how do you deal with that? And we're all going to need support, and we're all going to need to know that we're not on our own. And it's about finding that support and working a strategy through so that you're not a victim. Well, I'm not going away. I'm not going away anytime soon. I don't think Lucy's going to be able to get rid of me that quickly. So being the founder, both myself and Nicola are there, and hopefully we're not going to be like former prime ministers sitting on the back benches just sniping at those who are in charge. But we want to be there to support. You know, I still love Wish, I still love what we do, and I love the women. But what stepping back from being the chair does, it just gives me a little bit more time. As I said, I am 60 now, and I'm taking advantage of, in London, my Oyster card, my over 60 Oyster card to travel. And it just means I'll be able to do other things. And one of the things that I really, really want to do and I'm passionate about is doing more in terms of learning about British Sign Language. I'd love to become an interpreter. And so I want to do a little bit more of that, and I just need a little bit more time in order to focus on that. But yeah, no, I'm not going away anytime soon.